The auctioneer's chant was a machine gun rattle against the cold November wind, each word a spent casing tumbling onto the frozen mud. Frank Miller stood near the back, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn canvas jacket, the collar turned up against the bite in the air. He wasn't here to buy, not really. He was here to watch a man's empire die. Piece by piece, Roger Albright's future was being sold to the highest bidder. A John Deere 4840, barely 2 years old, its green paint still gleaming under the weak sun, went for 60 cents on the dollar. A Kinzer planter, the kind with all the newfangled liquid fertilizer tanks and markers that folded up with the push of a hydraulic lever, followed it. Then came the heart of the operation, a matched pair of International Harvester 1486 tractors. They were big, powerful machines with air-conditioned cabs and radios, the very symbols of modern, progressive farming. Frank had seen Roger driving them from the road, sitting high up in his glass box, looking down on the world. Today, Roger wasn't looking down on anyone. He stood beside the auctioneer's trailer, his shoulders slumped inside a clean Carhartt jacket that looked too new for the occasion, his face pale and slack. The crowd was a mix of neighbors, vultures, and the simply curious. They picked over tool racks and parts bins, kicking tires and murmuring about interest rates and commodity prices. Most of them avoided looking at Roger directly, affording him a small circle of isolation. They were farmers. They knew this could be any one of them. The bank didn't care about drought or blight or a Russian grain embargo. The bank only cared about the note. Frank watched the 1486 go. A syndicate of investors from 3 counties over bought them both, probably to ship them south where the credit was a little looser. Roger didn't even flinch. It was as if he'd been bled dry of all emotion, leaving only a hollow shell. Frank had known this day was coming. He'd seen it building for years, like a thunderhead on the western horizon. It started in the 70s when the government told them to plant fence row to fence row, and the banks were throwing money at anyone who could sign their name. Roger had been first in line. He bought land, bought iron, built a new house with a 2-car garage. He farmed more acres than anyone in the township, his operation a marvel of speed and efficiency. He'd cornered Frank at the co-op one spring morning, smelling of fresh coffee and confidence. "Frank," he'd said, clapping him on the shoulder, "you're working yourself to death on that little patch of ground. The bank's got money to lend at 7%. You could double your acreage, get yourself a new tractor. That old farm all of yours belongs in a museum." Frank had just nodded. "The farm all's paid for, Roger, and so is the ground it sits on." Roger had laughed, a big booming sound that turned heads in the co-op. "You can't get ahead thinking like that. You got to use their money to make your money. It's the modern way." Now, the modern way had led him here, to a muddy field where strangers picked over the bones of his ambition. Frank felt a cold, grim satisfaction. Not pleasure in Roger's ruin, but a quiet affirmation of his father's words, spoken decades ago in the dusty barn that still stood on Frank's property. "Debt," his father had said, his voice raspy from a lifetime of unfiltered cigarettes and hard work, "is a chain you forge yourself. The bank gives you the steel, but you're the one who puts it around your own neck." As the last of the big equipment was sold, the auctioneer moved on to the smaller items. An old Lincoln stick welder, a set of heavy-duty chains, a collection of greasy wrenches. This was more Frank's territory. He ambled closer, his worn work boots sinking slightly into the churned-up earth. He saw a pile of old steel I-beams and thought they might be useful for a bridge project over the creek on his back 40. That's when Roger saw him. His eyes, which had been dull and lifeless, suddenly sparked with a bitter, resentful fire. He strode over to Frank, his steps unsteady. "Come to pick the scraps, Miller," he sneered, his voice low and gravelly. "See what a real farmer's operation looks like when it's laid bare." Frank met his gaze. He could smell the stale whiskey on Roger's breath. "I'm sorry for your trouble, Roger." "The hell you are," Roger spat. "You're loving this, standing there all high and mighty with your paid-for junk. You and that ridiculous bulldozer. You think you're so smart, don't you? Scratching in the dirt like your granddaddy while the rest of us were building something." Frank's jaw tightened. He thought of his junk, the old Farmall M his father had bought new in '49. The John Deere 730 diesel he'd painstakingly rebuilt himself. And the heart of it all, the machine that had made his farm possible. The Alice Chalmers HD6 crawler, a 10-ton chunk of pure American iron. It wasn't a farm tractor, it was an earth mover, a stump puller, a force of nature. It was the reason his land was productive, the reason he'd never had to ask the bank for a dime to improve it. "My junk will be running tomorrow, Roger," Frank said, his voice flat and even. "It'll be working, and it won't owe a man a thing." Roger just shook his head, a broken man laughing without humor. "You just wait, your time's coming. This new economy, it chews up little guys like you." He turned and stumbled back toward his wife's station wagon, a ghost at his own funeral. Frank watched him go, the cold wind whipping at his jacket. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt weary. He looked at the remnants of Roger's fleet, the shiny, expensive machines that had promised so much and delivered only ruin. He thought of his old, ugly, grease-stained Dozer sitting in his shed, waiting for him. A machine built for one purpose: relentless, unstoppable work. Before we go any further, and before I tell you how that 10-ton beast of a machine saved my family's farm, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever had to choose between taking on debt for something new and shiny or sticking with the old, reliable that you owned outright? Whether it was a car, a tool, or a house, it's a choice that defines a man. Let me know your story in the comments below. We've all been at that crossroads. The story of the Dozer began 15 years earlier, in the spring of 1970. Frank's father had passed away that winter, leaving him the 180-acre farm. It was a good piece of ground, but it was raw. 60 acres of it was wooded, rocky hillside, and another 30 was a low-lying swamp that was underwater half the year. His father had farmed the 100 good acres and left the rest to the deer and the bullfrogs. The inheritance came with the land, the old barn, a small farmhouse, the 49 Farmall M, and a clear title. No debt. It was his father's final, most important gift. Frank knew he couldn't make a living for his wife Sarah and their young son on just 100 acres. Not in the long run. The neighbors were all expanding, buying up land as it became available. But Frank didn't have the cash for that, and he'd made a silent promise at his father's graveside to never let the bank get its hooks into the Miller land. So he had to make more land. He found the Dozer at a state highway department surplus auction. It was an Alice Chalmers HD6, built sometime in the late 1950s. It was painted a faded, chipped yellow with rust blooming along the edges of the 8-foot straight blade. The seat was torn, the gauges were cracked, and it was caked in a decade of dried mud and diesel soot. But the undercarriage looked solid, the sprockets and rollers showing wear, but no major damage. And under the hood was a Detroit diesel 371 engine, a 2-stroke screamer. Frank knew the sound well from his time in the Army Corps of Engineers. It was a tough, reliable motor, if a bit noisy and leaky. He paid $2,000 for it, cash he'd saved up from selling off some timber his father had cut the year before he died. When he had it hauled to the farm, the neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. Roger Albright, who was just starting to build his empire, leaned against his new pickup truck and watched as the lowboy driver carefully backed the 10-ton machine off the trailer. "Gonna farm with that thing, Frank?" Roger had called out, a smirk on his face. "Doesn't look like it has a 3-point hitch. Where's the PTO?" A few other farmers who had gathered to watch the spectacle chuckled. Frank just grunted as he climbed up onto the steel tracks. "I'm not going to farm with it," he said, settling into the worn seat. "I'm going to make the farm with it." That first summer was a trial by fire. Frank wasn't a farmer, he was a construction crew of one. He started with the 30-acre swamp. Every morning before the sun was fully up, he'd be out there. The ritual was always the same. Check the oil, a thick black syrup that smelled of work. Check the coolant. Pump a few shots of grease into the dozen fittings on the rollers and idlers until fresh grease pushed the old, gritty stuff out. Then he'd climb aboard, set the throttle, and hit the starter. The Detroit would churn, then catch with a cloud of blue smoke and settle into its distinctive, high-pitched, rattling roar. It wasn't the loping rumble of a farm tractor. It was the angry scream of a machine designed to tear the world apart. He started by digging a main drainage ditch, 6 feet deep and 10 feet wide, right through the center of the swamp, aimed toward the creek at the far end of his property. The work was brutal and slow. The HD6, for all its power, was not a massive machine. The wet clay would suck at the tracks, trying to pull it down. Frank had to learn the machine's balance, how to use the blade to pull himself forward, how to feel the ground through the levers in his hands. He smelled of diesel and hydraulic fluid for months. His hands were permanently stained with grease. At night he'd fall into bed, his muscles aching, his ears still ringing with the engine's scream, and Sarah would rub his sore shoulders, her face a mixture of worry and pride. The community watched him from the road. The talk at the feed mill was that Frank Miller had finally cracked. Playing in the mud with that old toy, they'd say, while the corn's burning up in the field. They didn't understand. Frank was trading one season's crop for 50 seasons of productivity. He was investing sweat instead of credit. He had to learn the machine intimately. He bought a thick, grease-stained service manual and read it by the light of a kerosene lamp at the kitchen table. He learned how to adjust the track tension, a dirty, knuckle-busting job involving a massive wrench and a lot of swearing. He learned how to pull the injectors on the Detroit diesel and clean them. One sweltering day in August, a hydraulic line for the blade lift blew, spraying hot, stinking fluid all over the engine. It was a custom-bent steel line, not something he could just buy at the auto parts store. The dealership wanted $400 and a 2-week wait. Frank couldn't afford either, so he took the broken line, fired up his old stick welder, and spent an entire afternoon painstakingly brazing the crack, reinforcing it with a steel sleeve he cut himself. It was an ugly repair, but it held. It was his first real victory over the machine, the moment he went from being its operator to its master. By the first frost, the main ditch was done. Over the winter, he used the Dozer's powerful rear winch to clear the scrub trees and pull the stumps from the 60-acre hillside. He'd wrap a thick steel cable around the base of a stubborn oak, lock the Dozer's brakes, and engage the winch. The Detroit would scream under the load, the whole 10-ton machine groaning, the cable stretching taut as a guitar string, until, with a great tearing sound of roots letting go, the tree would be ripped from the earth. He piled the trees and stumps into massive heaps to cure, firewood for the next 10 winters. The following spring, as the snow melted, the water in the swampy low ground didn't pool and stagnate. It flowed slowly but surely into his new ditch and away to the creek. By May, the 30 acres were dry enough to walk on. By June, he had it disked and planted in soybeans. That fall, he pulled more beans off those 30 new acres than he did off any other part of the farm. He'd done it. He'd made land. And it hadn't cost him a penny in interest. The mid-1970s arrived, and with them a tidal wave of money in American agriculture. Russian grain deals, soaring exports, and government subsidies created a gold rush mentality. Land prices doubled, then tripled. The talk in town was no longer about bushels per acre, but about leverage and cash flow. The local bank hired a new loan officer, a young man in a suit who talked about amortization schedules and depreciation allowances. He was Roger Albright's best friend. Roger went all in. He bought the 200 acres that bordered his farm to the west, signing a mortgage that made old-timers shake their heads. To work the new ground, he traded his already impressive equipment for the biggest and best. The International Harvester 1466 arrived, a red monster with dual rear wheels and a turbocharged engine that you could hear from a mile away. He bought a new Gleaner L2 combine with a 20-foot grain head. He built a 60 by 100-foot machine shed to house his new fleet, a gleaming steel monument to his success. Roger was no longer just a farmer, he was an agribusinessman. He was featured in the county newspaper, standing in front of his new combine, smiling, the very picture of the bold modern farmer. Frank felt the pressure. He was making good money, the best of his life. The new ground the Dozer had created was his most profitable. But his operation looked pathetic next to Roger's. While Roger was planting 100 acres a day with a 12-row planter, Frank was still chugging along with his old 4-row unit pulled by the John Deere 730. When Roger's fleet of grain trucks was hauling corn to the elevator, Frank was making trip after trip with his single overloaded gravity wagon. The social pressure was worse. At church, the other farmers' wives would talk about their new kitchen renovations or the vacations they were planning. Sarah would just smile and nod, but Frank could see the longing in her eyes. Their son, now in grade school, came home one day and asked why they didn't have a tractor with a cab and a radio like his friend, Roger Albright's boy. "Because our tractors don't have a payment book that comes with them," Frank had told him, maybe a little too harshly. Instead of leveraging his profits, Frank stuck to his principles. He used the extra cash to improve what he had. He tiled another 20 acres of low ground, paying the contractor in cash. He rebuilt the engine on the Farmall M himself, ordering the parts from the catalogue and spending a winter in the cold shop, methodically taking it apart and putting it back together better than new. He bought another 80 acres that connected to his back 40, but it was a piece of rough, wooded ground nobody else wanted. He got it cheap, paying cash from 3 years of saved profits. And the first thing he did was unload the HD6 and start clearing a road into it. He was seen as a relic, a stubborn old fool who was afraid of progress. Roger would drive by Frank's place in his new Lincoln Continental, shaking his head at the sight of Frank out on the old Dozer, covered in dirt and grease. To Roger, and to most of the county, Frank Miller was a man being left behind by history, a failure who lacked the vision and courage to seize the opportunity of a lifetime. The end of the decade approached like a bad storm. The news on the radio was all about inflation, an oil crisis, and hostages in Iran. The easy credit that had fueled the farm boom began to dry up. Frank was at the co-op one afternoon in the fall of '79, settling his account for the year. He always paid in full, a practice that was becoming increasingly rare. The manager, a weary-looking man named Henderson, took Frank's check with a grateful nod. "Wish I had 100 more customers like you, Frank," Henderson said, leaning on the counter. "Most guys are just paying the interest, rolling the principal over for another year." "Times are good," Frank said, though he didn't believe it. "They'll catch up." Henderson shook his head, lowering his voice. "Times are changing. The bank called this morning. Prime rate just hit 15%. 15. The variable loans they wrote to guys like Roger Albright are resetting. I don't know how he's going to make his payments. The man's leveraged to the hilt." A cold knot formed in Frank's stomach. He looked out the grimy office window. Across the road, parked in front of the implement dealership, was a brand-new tractor. It was a Steiger, a massive, articulated four-wheel drive, the kind of machine that could pull a 12-bottom plough. It had Roger Albright's name written all over it. Frank knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Roger had just signed the papers for it. He had doubled down one last time, convinced the good times would never end. Frank walked out into the crisp autumn air. He climbed into his old Ford pickup, the one he'd bought used 10 years ago. It started with a familiar, comforting rumble. He drove home, the setting sun casting long shadows across the harvested fields. He thought of Roger's new Steiger and the mountain of debt it represented. He thought of his own farm, his ugly, powerful Dozer, and the beautiful, reassuring absence of a signature on a banker's loan document. The reckoning was coming. He could feel it in the wind. And for the first time, he felt a deep, lonely fear. Not for himself, but for the neighbors who had laughed at him, who had mistaken the clatter of his old machine for the sound of failure, when all along it had been the sound of survival. The spring of 1980 arrived late and angry. A cold, wet April kept the planters in the sheds, and when the rain finally stopped, the sun came out with a vengeance. The sky turned a hard, cloudless blue, and by June the corn was already curling, the leaves twisting inward to protect themselves from the relentless heat. The rain that everyone prayed for never came. Instead, hot, dry winds blew in from the southwest day after day, sucking the last bit of moisture from the topsoil and carrying it away as a fine brown haze that hung on the horizon. For Roger Albright, the drought was a disaster movie playing out in slow motion. His new Steiger tractor, the four-wheel drive behemoth he'd bought on credit, sat idle most of the time. It was too heavy for the delicate work of cultivation, and its primary purpose, pulling a massive chisel plough through hundreds of acres of fall tillage, was still months away. It was $1 million tool for a 10-cent job, a monument to an optimism the weather was scorching out of existence. His operating loan for fuel and fertilizer, taken out when the interest rate was a staggering but manageable 16%, had just reset. The letter from the bank informed him his new rate was 19.5. Frank watched the disaster unfold from his own fields. His corn was suffering too, but his land, enriched by years of manure from his small herd of cattle and with a higher organic content from the swamps he'd reclaimed, held moisture better. It wasn't thriving, but it was surviving. He worked his fields with the John Deere 730, the old two-cylinder engine making its rhythmic, familiar pop, pop, pop sound. It burned a fraction of the fuel of Roger's big IH tractors. His costs were low. His break-even point a number Roger hadn't seen in a decade. The first real crack in Roger's empire appeared in July. One of his International 1486, the pride of his fleet before the Steiger, threw a rod through the side of the block while chopping silage. The sound, a violent metallic explosion followed by the shriek of grinding metal, carried across the valley. Frank heard it from his workshop. A few hours later, he saw the implement dealer's service truck heading up Roger's lane. The next day, he saw the tractor being hauled away on a lowboy trailer. The talk at the co-op was that the engine was destroyed beyond repair. A new engine block, plus the labor from the union mechanics at the dealership, would cost over $10,000. It was money Roger didn't have. The tractor sat in the dealer's dead row for the rest of the summer, a silent red testament to catastrophic failure. Roger started selling off his breeding stock of cattle to make ends meet, flooding a market already weakened by farmers doing the same thing. The price he got was heartbreaking. He grew thin, his face etched with lines of worry. The confident boom of his voice was replaced by a quiet, defensive rasp. He stopped coming to the co-op for coffee in the mornings, sending his hired man instead. Frank, meanwhile, put his old dozer to work. The creek that ran through the back of his property was nearly dry, reduced to a series of stagnant pools. He took the HD6 down into the creek bed, the Detroit diesel screaming in the still, humid air, and began cleaning it out. He deepened the channel, reinforced the banks, and dug a new deep pond near his pasture to act as a reservoir. It was brutal work under the blazing sun. The steel of the machine was too hot to touch, and the air shimmered in the diesel exhaust, but he was improving his land, creating a buffer against the next drought. He was working. Roger was just waiting for the phone to ring. The rains finally came in late August, but they came with a fury. A line of thunderstorms rolled through, dropping 5 inches of rain in 2 hours. The hard-baked soil couldn't absorb it. The water ran off the fields, carrying topsoil with it, cutting deep gullies in the hillsides. The county road that ran past both Frank's and Roger's farms washed out where it crossed a low-lying culvert. A 10-foot section of road was simply gone, replaced by a muddy, impassable torrent. For 2 days, they were cut off. The school bus couldn't get through, the mail wasn't delivered. The township trustee said it would be a week before the county road crew could get to it. Frank didn't wait. He fired up the HD6. He spent an entire day in the muck, first winching a massive fallen oak tree out of the ditch, then carefully pushing load after load of earth and rock back into the washout, building a temporary causeway. By nightfall, his pickup could get across. The next morning, the mail carrier and the school bus followed his lead, inching carefully over his rough repair. When the county crew finally showed up 3 days later, their road grader just had to smooth out the work Frank had already done. That evening, Frank saw Roger's Lincoln Continental drive slowly over the repaired section. The car stopped for a moment, and Frank, standing by his mailbox, could just make out Roger's silhouette behind the wheel, staring at the patch of raw earth his neighbor had moved. He didn't wave, he didn't honk. He just sat there for a long minute before driving on, the dust from his tires hanging in the twilight air. It was the first time Roger had ever needed something Frank had, and the silence of that moment was louder than any engine. The harvest of 1981 was a funeral. The yields were half of what they should have been, and the price of corn had collapsed due to a worldwide glut. The news from Washington was grim. To fight runaway inflation, the Federal Reserve had raised the prime interest rate to an unthinkable 21.5%. For farmers like Roger, who lived on variable rate operating loans, it was a death sentence. The math simply no longer worked. The cost of the money he had borrowed to plant the crop was now more than the crop was worth. The foreclosure notices started appearing in the county paper like obituaries. Good families, good farmers, who had farmed the same ground for generations, were being wiped out. They had all followed the same advice, the same gospel of get big or get out. They had leveraged their equity to expand, believing the experts who told them that land values would never go down and commodity prices would always go up. They had built their houses on a foundation of debt, and now the foundation was turning to quicksand. Roger Albright held on longer than most, but his fall was the hardest. The bank, the same one whose loan officer had once taken him out for steak dinners, was now a cold, impersonal enemy. They called his notes, all of them. The mortgage on the 200 acres, the loan on the Steiger, the line of credit for his operating expenses. It was all due immediately. He had no way to pay. His assets, the land and the iron, were worth less than half of what he owed. The day of the auction was the final public humiliation. It brought the story full circle, back to that cold November morning. But now Frank understood the hollow look in Roger's eyes. It wasn't just the loss of money, it was the loss of identity. Roger Albright wasn't a farmer anymore, he was just a man in a new jacket standing in the mud, watching his life get sold off in lots. Frank survived. He did more than survive, he was stable. The drought had hurt his bottom line, and the low prices stung, but there were no letters from the bank in his mailbox. His income was down, but his expenses were a tiny fraction of Roger's. He didn't have to pay thousands a month in interest. His fuel bill was manageable. When his John Deere 730 needed a new water pump, he bought one for $80 and put it on himself in an afternoon. His property taxes were his single biggest expense, and he had the cash in his savings account to pay them. While his neighbors were panicking, Frank was planning. He saw opportunity where others saw only ruin. Not an opportunity to prey on their misfortune, but to solidify his own position. He used the dozer to clear another 20 acres on the wooded parcel he'd bought, the one nobody else had wanted. He piled the logs and sold them as firewood, a small but steady stream of cash that paid for his family's groceries through the winter. He was turning his own labor and the power of his old machine directly into capital, bypassing the banks entirely. He was an island of solvency in a sea of red ink. The very things he had been mocked for, his old small equipment, his refusal to expand on credit, his obsession with improving the land he already owned, had become his salvation. The clatter of his old dozer, once the sound of a stubborn fool, was now the sound of a prophet. The climax of the auction was the sale of the Albright home place, the original 80 acres with the house and the barns that had been in Roger's family for 3 generations. The auctioneer started the bidding low, but there were no takers. The crowd was silent. No one wanted to be the one to take a man's home. The bank representative, a grim-faced man in a suit, stepped forward and placed the opening bid. It was a cold, clinical transaction designed to set a floor price for the bank to reclaim the property. Then a voice came from the back. "I'll bid $10 more." Every head turned. It was Frank Miller. He stood tall, his face unreadable. Roger, who had been staring at the ground, looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief and a fresh wave of shame. He thought Frank was there to deliver the final insult, to buy his ancestral home out from under him for pennies on the dollar. The bank man sighed, annoyed, and raised the bid by $1,000. $10 more, Frank said again, his voice firm and clear. They went back and forth, the bank man making large jumps, Frank adding just $10 each time. It was a strange, tense duel. Frank wasn't trying to win. He was making a point. He was forcing the bank to pay for what it was taking, making the process slow and public and uncomfortable. He was standing up for a neighbor, even a neighbor who had scorned him. Finally, the price reached a number Frank couldn't touch, and the auctioneer's gavel fell. The bank owned the Albright farm. As the crowd dispersed, a defeated Roger walked over to Frank. The anger and resentment were gone, replaced by a raw, bewildered sorrow. "Why, Frank?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Why'd you do that? To make me look even smaller?" Frank shook his head. He looked Roger square in the eye. "No, Roger. I did it because that's your father's ground. A man's ground shouldn't be taken without a fight, even if it's a fight you know you're going to lose. I did it out of respect for him." Tears welled in Roger's eyes. He nodded, unable to speak, and turned away. In that moment, the rivalry that had defined their lives dissolved, leaving only two farmers in a world that had turned against them both. A week later, Roger and his family were packing up to move. They were heading to the city, where his wife had family and he had a line on a job managing a hardware store. Frank drove up their lane in his old pickup. He found Roger in the machine shed, the one that had once housed a fleet of gleaming iron, now cavernously empty. He was coiling up an old air hose, one of the few things the bank hadn't taken. "I need a man to help me for a few weeks," Frank said without preamble. "I'm clearing a fence row on my back 80. Need someone to run a chainsaw, help me burn brush. I can pay cash." Roger looked at his hands, soft for the first time in his life. I don't know, Frank." "It's honest work," Frank said, "and I could use the help." For the next 2 weeks, the two men worked side by side. Frank was on the HD6, its roaring engine a constant presence, skillfully pushing over trees and piling stumps. Roger, humbled and quiet, did the groundwork. They didn't talk much about what had happened. They talked about the weather, about the price of fuel, about the right way to sharpen a chainsaw chain. One afternoon, as they sat on a log sharing a thermos of coffee, Roger finally spoke. "You know," he said, staring at the Dozer, "I used to laugh at you for buying that thing. Thought you were crazy." He shook his head. "Turns out that machine's got more common sense than I ever did. It does one thing. It works. It doesn't ask for much, and it doesn't promise you the world. It just works." "It's paid for," Frank said simply. "That's its best feature." The years that followed were lean, but for the Miller family they were good. Frank's son Tom came back to the farm after high school. He had his father's cautious nature, but his own knack for mechanics. He learned how to weld from Frank, how to rebuild a carburetor, how to listen to an engine and know what it needed. The farm crisis had scoured the community, but those who survived, like the Millers, emerged stronger, tougher, and wiser. The new gospel in the heartland wasn't about leverage. It was about equity. It wasn't about expansion. It was about efficiency. Frank never got big. He slowly and carefully bought 2 more parcels of land over the next decade, both of them adjacent to his own, and both times he paid cash, using money he had saved. His farm grew to just over 400 acres, a modest but highly productive operation. He never bought a brand new tractor. Instead, he and Tom would find good, used equipment at auctions. Machines from the 70s with simple electronics and durable engines. And they would rebuild them in their shop over the winter. Their fleet was a patchwork of green and red and orange, but it was all theirs. Nothing belonged to the bank. The old Alice Chalmers HD6 Dozer remained the heart of the operation. It looked ancient now, its yellow paint almost completely gone, its steel blades scarred and dented from 30 years of combat with rocks and stumps. But every spring, Tom would give it a full service, and when Frank climbed into the worn steel seat and hit the starter, the Detroit 371 would still roar to life with its signature scream, ready for another season of relentless work. It had built their farm, defended it, and secured its future. It was more than a machine, it was a member of the family. One crisp October afternoon, when Frank was well into his 70s, he stood on the hill overlooking his farm. His son, Tom, was in the valley below, driving their John Deere 4440, disking the cornstalks under. Beside Tom, in the buddy seat, was Frank's grandson, a boy of 8, his face pressed against the glass, watching the land turn over. Frank felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Sarah. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the scene. The setting sun lit the autumn leaves on fire, and the air smelled of rich earth and diesel smoke. "You did it, Frank," she said softly. "You built all this." He shook his head slightly. "We built it," he corrected her, "and the Dozer." He thought of Roger Albright. They exchanged Christmas cards every year. Roger had done well for himself at the hardware store, eventually buying the place. He was happy in his own way, but Frank knew he still dreamed of the land. He had learned a hard lesson, a lesson that had cost him everything. Frank had learned the same lesson from his father, for free. Debt is a chain you forge yourself. Progress isn't about having the newest and the biggest. It's about ending each day a little freer than you were when it started. It's about owning the ground beneath your feet, not just holding the note for it. He looked down at his own hands, gnarled and stained from a lifetime of work. He thought of the cold, hard feel of the dozer's levers, the vibration of the machine coming up through the steel seat. The feeling of power, not over other men, but over the earth itself. The power to shape it, to make it better, to make it his own. The rhythmic pop-pop of the old John Deere echoed up the valley, a sound as steady and reliable as a heartbeat. It was the sound of his legacy. It was the sound of survival. It was the sound of a farm that was, and would always be, free and clear.